지금은 그 지금은 rộng mà không.
Summertime.
That's enough to give us a taste here.
Nice.
Alright, I'm going to close the door behind you and keep whatever heat we've got for a few minutes. Alright, so before I forget to say this, one thing that's kind of cool about this site is that we have a really nice show and tell of different high tunnels and why you might want to consider spending more or less money on a high tunnel. So the tunnel that we're standing in right now is kind of a high-end, state-of-the-art. You know, we have the fancy hard end walls. We've got a lot of really nice bracing, which makes it better able to withstand snow load. And we have a blower fan that runs 24/7 year-round, which keeps a double layer inflated. So that gives us a tiny little bit of insulation, but what it really does is makes the plastic better able to withstand snow load. So I don't need to worry quite as much about coming and shoveling snow off this all the time. We have shoveled this once with a roof break, and I'm actually gonna shovel it again on Friday before our weekend storm to get the remnants off. Partly because it blocks our sun and we have winter spinach growing, so I want as much solar gain in here as I can. So I'm going to just take a couple minutes to tell you about what we're doing. This high tunnel is actually owned and managed by the university. I work with an organic research group at the U of M. So although it's good acre land, they're kind enough to let us do our thing here. So right now we have a 4-year research project in progress. We're looking at year 2.5 or so right now. And this same study is actually replicated as well in Kansas and Kentucky. So it's kind of cool to see how the same system does in different climates. And the answer is very different. So that's kind of fun. So what you're looking at is us trying to play with different times that we might be able to fit cover crops in our high tunnels. High tunnels, as you all know, are super cool that we can get a lot of nice season extension in the spring, fall, grow things in the summer with extra heat. We can manage our water really nicely so we don't have plant diseases in the same way. But it's really hard to manage soil health because we don't have the same opportunities to rotate crops. A lot of growers want to use them super intensively, which means that we're depleting some of that soil organic matter more quickly in the high tunnel than we might in the field. So we are hoping that our research can help farmers identify some ways that they can get cover crops into the rotation. The way a lot of organic farmers manage fertility is by adding composted cow manure or any animal manure, whatever your neighbors have available. That's great. One problem with it is that it typically brings a lot more phosphorus in than you need relative to the amount of nitrogen that your plants want. So cover crops can help with that, especially legume cover crops can provide some nitrogen in the soil without that phosphorus boost, and also build some soil organic matter at the same time. So what you're seeing right now is a mix of 3 different calendars essentially. So over here in the corner we have rye, or somewhere under here we also have rye and vetch mixed together. So that cover crop we are planting in the fall after we've grown summer tomatoes. We pull our tomatoes out, we plant a rye vetch cover crop, and we expect it to grow a little bit in the fall, die back at frost, and then come back very early in the spring. So by the time we mow it down to plant next year's tomatoes again, it's going to be easily 6 feet tall. And you can see right now, even with the really super cold temperatures we've had this year, it doesn't look too bad, all things considered. The next plot here is vetch only. So the vetch is looking pretty toasted. This is at the kind of dark purple, but if you really look under that, you can see some green leaves. And once we start having warmer spring temperatures, that's going to bounce back really nicely. This particular plot doesn't have great vetch coverage because we're still dealing with some pretty severe compaction issues down the center of this tunnel from when we built it with heavy equipment 3 years ago. If I pulled back more of this row cover, you would see other configurations of rye and vetch mixed, etc. The other, let's see here, we've got 8 different treatments, so let's see what else we can find. Another treatment that we're trying is a winter kill mix. So while the Rye Vetch we expect to be planted in the fall and then come back in the spring, we are also planting something in the fall around the same time that we expect to die in the frost and not come back. So in this case, we're using cowpea millet, which isn't a super great choice for Minnesota. We're using it because it works well for our partners in Kansas and Kentucky. A better choice in Minnesota might be oats and peas because they germinate and do better in the cooler temperatures that we're likely to have in the fall. The idea with that mix, though, is that we would plant something in the fall, get a really nice amount of biomass, and then when it dies back, we have something covering the soil. We don't have to worry about erosion and rainfall issues quite so much in the high tunnel, but it's still nice to have that soil covered, to have some roots in the soil that are breaking down over the course of the winter. And then ideally in the spring, we have a plot that's ready to go into really early because we don't have to terminate a cover crop. This Rye Vetch is going to be a bit of a bear for me to terminate in the spring before I put tomatoes in. So if I knew that I wanted to go into my high tunnel really early with spring greens or something, I probably wouldn't plant Rye Vetch, but a winter kill crop like oats and peas might be a really nice choice. And then the third thing we're looking at is a summer cover crop. So in that instance, we're planting an early spring crop, something like kale, arugula, spring greens, lettuce, anything like that. And then a summer cover crop, we are doing a mix of cowpeas and sorghum Sudan grass. And then we have time for a fall crop, in this case spinach. So we have spinach that is looking kind of toasted from the frost now, but we think that our growing point is still okay. So we're really excited about that despite the cold temperatures that we've had this winter. We're anticipating that we're going to get another spring spinach harvest. We are seeing a little bit of rodent damage here, more than frost damage actually. So in this instance, we're saying we really want to maximize our shoulder season spring fall crops, and we're going to take it out of production for a little bit of that really hot summertime to get our cover crop in then. So that's it. That's the maybe 7 or 8 minute overview of what we're doing. I'd be happy to answer any quick questions before I turn it over to the SFA folks.
Is this like a penny press over here, or is that intentional?
It is, no.
Is that
so as you will find out when you start digging holes, the soil here is terrible, like terrible. This whole chunk of land that these tunnels are on was a parking lot for the florist that used to be in this location. So it is super compacted gravel, like tons of dirty fill. We pull like old cast iron pipes, porcelain toilet parts out of here all the time. We keep a bucket in here in the summer to fill with broken glass. So super urban soils. So to help ameliorate that problem, we have brought in about 8 inches of topsoil from the research farms, and there just so happens to be a pennycress research group on campus. So yeah, all the pennycress is thanks to a different research project.
When it comes to high tunnels, have they designed high tunnels that can sit on a rail that they can move back and forth?
Yep, they do. We don't have one. I've worked with a few folks who do, and they can be super cool and allow for more rotation. You do need a pretty good chunk of pretty flat land for that to work. Usually they span 2 or sometimes even 3 footprints of the high tunnel. Anecdotally, I've seen a lot of people run into just kind of like building issues with them, that after a couple of years of the wheels get gunked up, the rails get gunked up, not unsolvable issues, but they don't just slide on down.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, it's a great idea, and people are definitely doing it. And it's a cool way to rotate stuff. Our partners in Kentucky actually have one, and they use it in some cool ways, that they're even, planting a crop into the high tunnel and then moving it mid-season, so that those tomatoes can, be just in natural environment in the summer, get rainfall. Tomatoes is a bad example for that. But then it gives you that high tunnel that you can use for a different tunnel crop more than once in that one season.
Question here.
Yeah.
pastores en casas, en invernaderos, es de que están aumentando mucho el fósforo a partir de materia orgánica de gallinazas o estiércol.
So one of the problems that the farmers have with greenhouses is that the phosphorus content increases a lot when they use cow manure or chicken manure.
Entonces buscan incrementar también la relación nitrógeno-fósforo o nitrógeno-carbono. En el año que llevan de investigación, entonces la avena y el chícharo es probablemente que aporte más nitrógeno en estos suelos.
So they're trying to vary the proportion of nitrogen and phosphorus, nitrogen and carbon. And so in the year that you've been investigating the combination of oats with peas, have they improved the nitrogen proportions in the soil?
Not in a year. So soils are slow. We would expect to see that. The biggest change isn't to some degree the plants are taking up the phosphorus, but the biggest thing is that we're trying to prevent the need to keep adding that imbalanced fertilizer.
Pero en la cuestión de nitrógeno sí está aportando el suelo.
But it isn't adding the nitrogen to the soil or no?
The legumes fix nitrogen, so they create a symbiotic relationship with soil rhizobia. So legume plants, peas, vetch, any bean family plant can pull nitrogen from the air. This experiment is looking a little bit more generally at what cover crops work well, but most of our other research projects are looking at exactly when is that nitrogen available. It is commonly believed that while the plant is alive, it has the nitrogen captured in its roots. It doesn't want to let it go. So it's only after you kill the plant that nitrogen becomes available. But you need soil microbes to break it down. So the plant dies, soil microbes break it down, and then it's available to the next plant. We believe that most commonly that process takes 3 to 5 weeks.
After it dies.
Yeah, so usually when we terminate a cover crop, we wait 2 weeks and then we plant our next crop. And then, that if you're putting either transplants or seeds, they don't need nitrogen from the soil right away. They either have that in their seed coat or they have that, in the little bit of starter fertilizer or potting mix. So usually that timing works out pretty well. It's super variable. So if it's hot and wet, it's going to be faster. If it's cold, it's going to be a lot slower. So we were just looking at data yesterday when we took soil samples from here last fall. Our peak nitrogen was actually at 11 weeks. So that's much longer, but it's not surprising because it was November.
Thank you.
What type of pests are you finding come in the winter?
We have not had any issues here other mice and rabbits are the biggest. You'll notice that we have some pretty intense fencing to try and deal with our mice and rabbits. Well, the rabbits, it doesn't do anything for the mice. We haven't had aphid issues in this tunnel, but in some of our other tunnels we've had some aphid issues. It's a good reminder. I actually have mouse traps in my car that I need to bring out here.
I've had whitefly infestations in my tunnel, and that seems to be a fairly common one in greenhouses too.
Do you get them in the winter?
No, it's just growing season.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions I can answer?
For the interpreter here,
Yeah.
what's veg?
Vetch. Vetch is
Vetch. V-E-T-C-H?
V-E-T-C-H. Yep.
Is that hairy vetch?
Hairy vetch, yeah. So it's this plant right here with the real skinny leaves. It's a legume, so it's one of the plants that we expect to fix nitrogen. And the U of M is actually doing some breeding on hairy vetch, trying to come up with more cold hardy varieties. This one is a standard VNS from Albert Lee.
Y el cultivo de la alfalfa no la tomaron en cuenta en este experimento, ya que puede aguantar un poco más el frío.
And you didn't consider alfalfa?
Looking at more annual things. alfalfa is a great option if we were, doing a multi-year rotation. We're trying to look at real tight little windows, and alfalfa would be hard to break down. Great.
Cool. Well, we're here to talk about soil health and make it to be something that you can easily comprehend, test. Like, you can take a very detailed, chemical analysis approach to it, or you can trust your instincts. And that's what we're here to talk about, is simple tests to gauge how you're doing, and also how to just trust your instincts, trust your senses, trust your ability to connect with nature, to gauge how you're doing with your soil health. And our whole thing at Sustainable Farming Association is, and just sustainable farming in general, is that your soil is, you take care of the soil. The mantra in organic farming is feed the soil, not the plant. If you take care of the soil, your results will come out of that. So we have a few just brief demonstrations out here. I know it's cold, but bear with us. Has anybody taken a soil test to send into a lab? Okay, well, I do it every few years on my farm just to get a baseline for that more detailed chemical analysis of the soil. So my soil lab, I had the guy who tests my soil show me in person how, the best method to extract a soil sample. I'd like to show you that now. And I think maybe if we can, I'm going to try digging here. So this is, you can get your soil tested at the University of Minnesota. They'll do a basic nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, organic matter, pH, those type of things. I'm not sure if they do micronutrients, which if you really want to get into what amendments should I be using, you might want to know that stuff. There are some private labs out there that can do soil testing to a much higher degree than what the university does. But for your basic starting soil test, probably the University of Minnesota is good. I use a place called a guy named Glenn Borgerding. I can't remember his business name. Do you know it? Ag Resource Consulting, maybe? Yeah, something like that. Anyway, so if you want to take a soil test, this is how my soil scientist showed me. You want to just get some soil out of the way here. Okay, so you want to basically take a sample from 1 inch below surface to 6 inches below surface. So, and you want, basically you're trying to extract a 5 inch long, 1 inch by 1 inch rectangle, or yeah, sliver kind of. So I'm going to basically slice. That soil isn't too intact, it's a little.
Is it frozen or rocky?
It's not really holding together well. But basically, I'm going to pretend this. I'm going to pretend I just sliced off a nice slab. It's dry. This is why. But let's say this is a nice just slab of soil about 1 inch, and then I don't think you want to use your hand too much. But the way it was described to me is you kind of take a knife and just, well, it's not working. Cut off, basically cut off the sides, and you're going to get a sliver down the middle. And you also want to remove just the top inch or so, because the plant matter, you don't want the debris that's on the soil surface. So if I've described that well, I'm not sure.
I think one by
But
one.
you want to go down to about 6 inches, remove the top inch, and just slice off the sides. And if the soil's a little bit more moist, you're going to have just basically a 1 by 1 thing. And depending on the size of your plot, let's say you have a half-acre field, 3-acre field, whatever it is, a 1/4 acre, 1 high tunnel, you're going to want to do this 5 to 7 different locations around that field. Dump it in a box, stir it all together, and basically you're getting an average. And then you'll fill up your soil sample bag.
Did you say in the introduction there's only like 3 acres? Or did I miss the number?
We'll talk about our farms inside.
No, I was going to say, like, in that area, square area, how many places do you take per acre?
Oh,
Places do you take?
oh, 5, like, just,
Let's say if you have 9 acres, let's say. Every acre?
Are you planting a single crop in the whole 9 acres?
No, not probably not.
Yeah, so that's how you subdivide your fields.
Okay.
So for example, I have 5 acres,
Yep.
and I subdivide them into half-acre plots.
Okay.
If I want to really test every single half-acre plot, I would take 5 or 6 little soil chunks from each half acre, blend them together, and do a separate soil test for each one. I don't do that. I go by soil type. These 3 fields are about the same. But the point is just to get an average. Don't just take 1 shovelful from your field and send it in. You need to to get a good scientific sample.
Sample size.
Yeah. So I wish it had worked a little better, but I hope I described it well enough.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's gonna help me with my garden at home, just to get an idea what's in it.
Yeah. Just the main thing is don't go too deep, because you're getting into where the plants aren't going to be growing, and eliminate the top about inch so you don't sample, like, you're going to get a skewed organic matter if you're sending in this straw.
Thank you.
Sure. So maybe we could go back out to that so then without having to send a sample into a lab. And it's kind of about creating a baseline, and then once you have a baseline, you can take the measurement again and see if there's been any improvement in your soil from there. So basically you'll start with, this is like a 4-inch PVC pipe. You could use a coffee can or a soup can or anything you have around. Just try and use the same device every time you take the soil test. So as you can see, this is kind of beveled on the edge so that it will go down into the soil. And there's also a line about 3 inches halfway up. So basically what you would do is get down to your soil surface and take this. If you're actually doing, I'm not going to actually do the test right now, but if you were actually doing it, you would want to take like a board across the top and then hammer it in until you get to that, down to that line. So then once you get that in the ground, you'll take a piece of plastic. It could be like extra plastic you have laying around or saran, like cling wrap, and you will line the hole with that plastic and put that down in there. So then you'll take some water, and you'll pour the water into this mold or this ring, and then pull the plastic out and start timing as soon as you pull the plastic out how long it takes for the water to infiltrate down into your soil. So then you're trying to figure out how many inches it infiltrates per hour. So you'll do, it took 10 minutes, so then you'll do 10 minutes divided by 60 minutes, and you'll get your inches per hour, for example. So again, it's a baseline, so you'll want to take the test again after you've used some techniques to improve your soil and see if the infiltration rate has improved or, hopefully it improved. If you're taking about 20 to 30 minutes per hour or 20 to 30 inches per hour, or 5 to 8 inches per hour. So basically, is it taking a really long time? Is it just not infiltrating down? That's probably an indication that you have a lot of soil compaction. and that could be from, repeated soil disruptions. Otherwise, is it, just going straight through? That could be that you have really good drainage, but you maybe don't have the good water retention. So, again, it's just a baseline of something simple you can do at your farm, at home. So,
can you go back to the part where you have the plastic? I didn't quite get
So you'll take a piece of plastic and line the inside of the ring with that piece of plastic, pour the water in to the ring, and then pull the plastic out. So basically that's to help get a more accurate reading of the time that it's taking to infiltrate.
How much water do you put in there?
So since it's a baseline measurement, I can't remember the exact what they said in the video that I looked up, but it's basically just make sure it's consistent from year to year, that you're using the same amount of water as you take that measurement. So
yeah, you have to do the math to figure out.
And then do a little
inches
math.
per hour is your goal.
Yeah.
So I've never done this, but I want to. My farm has heavier soil. It's a clay loam soil, and if I get a 2 or 3 inch rainfall, it all starts to just flow over and nothing is going in. So I want to improve my soil's ability to take in water.
Should we head in, or?
Yeah, we wanted to just mention a couple of other easy tests. We're not going to find earthworms in here today, but earthworms are typically an indicator of good soil health if you're in a agricultural setting. So that test is very simple. Dig down, count earthworms, like in the top 4 inches.
So you're basically looking for, if you have 20 to 60 earthworms in a cubic foot, you're doing pretty good. 60 or more would be exceptional. If you have any less than 20 per cubic foot, then there's probably something you could do to improve that habitat for them a little bit. So
the other one where I talked about just trust your senses is just smelling your soil. We call it the sniff test. So this, they poured some water on here. It's cold, but this is good moist soil, and just that smells good to me. If it smells sour, or if it smells acidic, or if it smells like metallic, just trusting your senses.
It should smell somewhat sweet and earthy.
Yeah, I don't know. If you want to take a chance, this smells good to me. So go pick some up.
I want to smell it.
Yeah,
And we have some more soil samples.
Nature, you can sense these things, and I would argue science has not yet given us. Science will give us the answer someday. But trust your body, trust your senses. If it smells off, if it smells sour. I've had anaerobic conditions, which is lack of oxygen, where my soil crusts over, and I dig down and it smells terrible. Yeah. Now I think we can head in.
Yeah,
So we do have a presentation that we wanted to do some of these kind of hands-on activities at the beginning. So we have 2 different activities involving water, and they're very simple but useful ways for you to determine aspects of your soil health.
I know, we forgot to grab one from up in the high. We were going to grab one from the high tunnel, but the cold was just distracting. So I could probably. Sure. So this is called the Slate Test. I thought it was the flake test, just for some reason, but it's actually the Slate Test. So basically, we're looking at how much biological glue is there in the soil. So I have a sample from the no-till high tunnel at my farm, and I also have a sample from my neighbor's corn and soybean field. So we'll get a chance, which they till and use sprays and whatnot. So we're kind of looking to see how well does the soil sample hold together. And this test and the infiltration test are some NRCS tests that they propose that we can use just as a simple test for our farms that we can do at home. So we have, 3 samples then, I guess? Or 4?
I think we have 4.
I wonder, do we have enough to... So we can
I can
do
grab a couple
duplicates or something.
Yeah.
So then basically you set up like you see here. We've seen you can use a screen as well, but this is pretty simple. So...
Yeah, we just basically cut the pop bottle here, took the cap off, inverted it, filled it up with water. So let's start off. This chunk of soil is from my high tunnel, and it's best if you're going to do this slate test to let the soil dry out for a few days inside. You don't want it muddy. I do have a muddy example here. That's because this is from my just a GMO cornfield from my neighbors, and I couldn't get it to dry out. I'm just like, what's going on that it won't? It just is this sticky, muddy mess that wouldn't dry out. So already I'm thinking there's some issue with this conventionally managed soil. So this one might not work so well since it's already muddy, but we'll give it a chance. And then this is from my high tunnel. So this farm grows corn 8 out of 10 years that I've seen it. I mean, that's all he does is corn.
Oh yeah.
It's just it's what you're watching. I don't think it should fall apart like that.
This is the corn and soybean sample from my neighbors, so we see they're doing. So it's actually not too bad, but it is falling apart a little bit.
So more microbial activity in your soil.
Oh no, sorry, that was the high tunnel sample.
Oh my God.
This is the no-till high tunnel. I was like, oh, they're doing pretty good. But then, yeah, obviously that's the conventional yearly tillage.
So we can see that both of our conventional managed. This is my high tunnel. I'm a little afraid. Yeah.
Together?
A little bit. I have not been very good with my high tunnel, so I'm not surprised to see it falling apart a little bit. Yeah, that's crazy.
This is a no-till high tunnel. This high tunnel hasn't been tilled for 3 years probably. And that is yearly tillage.
Do you till your no-till?
The no-till high tunnel, I never till at all. I use a broad fork for that, and then mulching, and that's it. So it's a small enough area. I intentionally built it so I couldn't get a tiller in there. I was like, this is a no-till zone. So I have no choice but to use a fork, or I use a broad fork, which is a little bit wider, like a double wide digging fork.
This is sand area that's tilled.
These are right next door to each other. This is, probably 200 feet in between. This is the no-till, and then this is yearly tillage.
Same with mine.
Spraying with.
It's 200 feet from that sample to that sample.
What holds it together is the microbial life in the soil.
It's the biotic glue. It's kind of the layman's terms.
Globulin, I can't remember microbial activity actually starts to create an adhesive in the soil it creates a soil particle. So your soil shouldn't just, if you're crushing soil apart, it shouldn't just fall apart into dust. It should hold together. As you break it down, it should break down into more particles like this. Like I could break this, that's another particle. It doesn't really fall apart, it just keeps breaking into smaller particles. Like even that little bit held together. If I crush it, it's gonna come apart, So that's good. Soil particles are kind of it's knit together by the life in the soil, and it's organic matter, the mineral elements, the chemical elements, and then this glue, and then the mycorrhizal fungi, all the plant roots, all those kind of knit together these soil particles.
I'll pass these two around too. This is the high tunnel example. And if you want to do the sniff test on this, and then this is the field corn and soybean rotation, that one right there. So you can notice the difference between the two. Or I guess I should pass them around together. Sorry, I'll take notes back.
I also wanted to show you a mason jar soil test. Question? Yep.
So we have 4 tests right now.
Yep.
I'm not sure if I'm processing it right, but so I'm thinking like this would be the okay soil. So which of these 4 will be the okay one now? What do we get from this? I mean, this is bad.
I would say the best managed soil in this one is Sarah's high tunnel, no till.
No till.
You don't want that to fall apart. You
So
want,
think about, like with erosion, for example, if with this field, if you had a heavy rainstorm, it's going to wash away all of those particles.
This will wash away.
Yeah.
yeah, the corn and soybean fields are, they have nothing to hold the soil together.
And then the other problem with this sample is the compaction as well. So you're kind of getting like the worst of both worlds. It's like, it's compact, so the plants struggle to emerge, but it's also, if you get the rain events, the erosion is going to be an issue.
But again, you wanted also the soil to retain the water. So if it does not break it apart, how does it retain the water? It's not going in.
This soil, it's like absorbing it like a sponge, you know, whereas this one, it's not absorbing it or anything. The water is just completely breaking it down. Whereas this one, it's actually holding on to the moisture. So this is an example of, so if you go home and do this with your soil or to your farm, you kind of can get a baseline of like where does yours end up in this. And again, do it after a year and see what the comparison is if you notice an improvement. So
Our presentation will be talking about ways
we'll
to
talk
address
about things
issues.
you can do
Yeah.
to help with this. So.
I'm going to do one more test for you. And this is called a mason jar soil test. And the purpose of this is to basically gauge your soil type. So all soil is comprised of, at its base is mineral elements, sand, silt, and clay. And the difference between sand, silt, and clay is particle size. Sand is the biggest, silt is tiny, clay is microscopic. Sandier soils tend to be more well drained, which can be good, but can also mean you're going to drought really quickly and have to always be irrigating. Clay soils stay wet, but are often too wet. So, you know, if you've heard the different soil types of like loam, clay loam, sandy loam, that's what this soil test, this mason jar soil test is here to tell you about. So I like to just, and here you do actually want to bust up your soil into kind of finer bits. Fill your mason jar about halfway with your soil.
What's the test called?
Mason jar soil test. And so this will tell you what soil type you have. You don't want to fill it all the way up. You want to leave a little room for shaking. So what you're going to do, cap it and just agitate it. Get it. You want to basically dissolve the soil into this water. You might have a few chunks. So after about a minute of shaking, and this takes a while. We might be able to see the results at the end of the class. And all of these tests we're showing you can just Google this stuff, go on YouTube and look at it. We just wanted to show you in person because the visuals always help. So I think that's good. I'm going to set this aside, and it's going to settle. It's going to separate. The sand will fall to the bottom, the silt will go in the middle, and the clay will be the last to settle in on top. And then what you can do is you can estimate percentage. So let's say you have 40% sand, 30% silt, and 30% clay. Then there's a chart, I don't know if you've seen it. I think we took it out of our presentation, but it's basically a triangle chart with sand, silt, and clay on the three angles, and you look at your percentages from this test, and it'll tell you your soil type. Do you have a sandy loam? Do you have a straight loam? Do you have a clay loam? Do you have a silty loam? My soil type is loam to clay loam. You know what yours is?
It's a pretty well balanced loamy soil.
Yeah.
Pretty lucky soil.
Cool.
I'm going to go into some more specific examples from
You're in. I'm in LeSueur County, so there's a big book that I can get for free from the county. It's a soils map, and I can go to the page with my farm, and it'll tell me. I have like 4 different soil types on my 5 acres. The map shows it all.
Okay, so we all probably have a bit of an idea of why soil health is important, but the way I see it is it really just makes, if you have good soil, it's really just going to make your life easier because you're not going to see the nutrient deficiencies or the pest problems that you have with poor soil. And it says here the key to farm profitability. So if you're getting more yield per plant, you're going to have a higher bounty at your farm. So basically, the way I see it is the more I can put into the soil health of the farm, the less I'm having to put into some of these other kind of Band-Aid solutions. Soil health is really more of a long-term solution to the problems that we face on our farms. And not to mention that the soil health is really what you leave behind on that land as your legacy. So after you leave the piece of land that you're farming, or whether you're passing that down to the next generation, think about what you're leaving behind for the next generation. So it's definitely a long-term type of thinking that will get you to the healthier soil. This provides a definition of soil health, so the capacity of soil to function as a vital living system to sustain biological productivity, promote environmental quality, and maintain plant and animal health. So basically, we have to look at soil as its own living being. And it's kind of an ecosystem, but if we're putting kind of the effort into improving our soil, you're going to improve that community that's living within the soil. So I think the key is really to look at the soil as you would look at a plant or a tree. It's a living thing to be nurtured and cared for. So I don't know if you have anything to add to why soil health is important to you. But. Yeah.
Well, so I just completed my 10th year of commercial vegetable farming last year. I'm going into my 11th. So my first few years, and this is why we're here to stress the importance of soil health from day one of your farm operation. I ran my farm just like, I over-tilled it. I took the rototiller out there and pulverized 6 inches because it felt good. It's all nice fluffy stuff to plant into. I moldboard plowed. So I feel like in my first few years of farming, I did way too much to the soil. And I started pretty quickly after years 4 or 5 to see yields decrease and plants having problems. Then I started to pay attention more towards soil health, and started really, because when you start your farm, you're like, I gotta make money. How can I sacrifice some of my land to grow cover crops? You're telling me I have to take half of my field out and just not grow a cash crop on it? How is that profitable? And so once I finally like I was doing cover crops from day one, but I really wasn't taking it that seriously until I saw a problem. And so in my last 5 years, I've really been intentional. We've scaled back. I have a 5-acre field, and I'm only growing vegetables on like 2 to 3 acres at any time. The rest of it is in cover crops. The rest of it is in soil building principles. So I'm rotating things in and out. So I just, from experience, like I would just say, take soil health seriously from day one. Don't get 4 or 5 years into it and you've starting to see yield loss and more weeds and just problems.
So I think it was mentioned at the beginning that we are both associated with the Sustainable Farming Association, and that's a great organization for farmer-to-farmer networking and also educational opportunities. There's a yearly conference that the SFA puts on. But a big focus of the SFA, or the Sustainable Farming Association, is soil health. And the soil experts that work with us have come up with these 5 soil health principles. So when I'm making decisions on, for example, cover cropping or crop rotations, or just how am I going to manage the fields that I'm growing on, I like to keep these principles in mind. And it's just kind of something you can do, again, kind of going back to that intuition. If you start kind of thinking with these soil health principles in the back of your mind, you will kind of be better equipped to make decisions. So just briefly running through them.
Pass those around. Those are just laminated like principles with just bullet points about different things within each soil principle that apply. And we'll be talking about all this.
Yeah, so we're going to go into these a little bit more in depth with examples, but just to briefly run through them. So keep the soil covered is, or sometimes we hear like armor your soil, so cover cropping, mulching. Minimize soil disturbances, so reducing tillage or other disturbances that we'll talk more about. Increasing crop diversity, which includes cover cropping, but also just some other ways to do that, like companion planting or interplanting. Keeping living roots in the soil, and integrating livestock. So we're going to go more into depth on each of these using some examples in a little bit here.
So indicators of good soil health. You want a lot of life in your soil. You want high microbial activity. And not just, the life in your soil is not just the bacteria, it's fungus, it's nematodes, it's insects, small mammals that live in your soil, voles and shrews, earthworms, like all this stuff, it truly is an ecosystem. Good soil has the ability to infiltrate and store water. Like you need your soil to be resilient against extreme rainfalls. You don't want a rain to come and just wash everything away, wash your tiny little seedlings away. You want your soil to be able to hold that water, but not too much. Like good soil and balance just gives you that perfect mix where you shouldn't really have to irrigate too much and it can withstand a heavy rainfall. Ability to cycle nutrients. Carbon, you have your major nutrients I mentioned is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then carbon is kind of like they call it the fuel. If plant growth is the fire, the carbon is the fuel that makes it all work. So you need high organic matter in your soil too. So good soil has the ability to cycle nutrients and make sure that your plants can access the nutrients it needs when it needs it. And high in organic matter. I think soils around here, you're doing good if you're above 5% organic matter. 10 to 15% is like super stellar, but I think 5 to 10% is a good average for good soil around here.
All right, so Josh talked a little bit about how it's not just the bacteria, it's the fungi, it's the nematodes, it's all of those great living things that are in the soil. So the different soil health principles we talked about will basically support a community where those organisms are able to thrive. And we're finding a lot of new information just now about soil health and really how the bacteria not only makes the nutrients available to the plants, but it's really communicating with the plants on like a level that humans can't even really comprehend. So by keeping the soil hydrated, keeping living roots in the soil, you're providing that ecosystem for these organisms to be able to thrive, and they're going to make sure that your plants are able to get the nutrients that are in the soil, and they're going to, even from the bacteria being able to help the plants recognize if there's predators, and they're able to emit the toxins that would deter the predatory insects. So like I was saying, just about how soil health can help with some of those problems, not just with like nutrient deficiencies, but even with pest management and things like that. So again, keeping the soil hydrated by armoring your soil with cover crops or mulch, and then increasing plant diversity. The number of different types of plants you have in your soil will provide the root exudates. So the roots are basically secreting these foods that the organisms eat. And the more different types of roots you have in your soil, the more food sources you're having for those different types of organisms. So you're going to be attracting a more diverse set of microbes to your soil. So,
have you all heard of mycorrhizal fungi? Like, if you haven't, like mycorrhizal fungi, like incredible. It truly is like the fungus. It's all about the mushrooms, man. I mean, like the fungus below the soil. Here's how it works. Like, your plant roots end. Let's say your plant roots are 6 to 8 inches long, and they get tinier and tinier. At the end of your plant roots, it starts the mycorrhizal network. So there's this entire system of, I won't go too much into fungus, but mycorrhizae is below ground. The mushroom that you see only pops out when it wants to reproduce. Like, there's fungus always living under the soil. And what it does is it creates a network that literally links all life together under the soil. All the plant roots. So, and it's to the degree where, let's say you have an oak tree over here and a maple tree over here, they can share nutrients through the mycorrhizal fungi. It is incredible. Like a plant that has an excess of nutrients wants to get rid of it, and another plant close by, even of a different species, can uptake that through the mycorrhizal network. So, like, fungus is so important. The only plant family that we grow as vegetable farmers that doesn't really connect with that network is the brassica family. So just don't assume that you're going to spray your broccoli with mycorrhizal fungi and it's going to be amazing, because the brassica family does not take part in that system.
Any questions about that kind of?
¿Qué técnicas podemos utilizar en nuestras parcelas para incorporar micorrizas?
What techniques can we use in our properties to incorporate mycorrhizae?
You can buy mycorrhizal fungi and apply it as a foliar spray on your soil. You can purchase it. You can also incorporate it into your potting mix and just start growing the fungus right there in your potting mix. I would argue that the best way to do it is just by simply taking care of your soil health in general, and the fungus will be there. I don't necessarily agree that, like, let's say your source of mycorrhizal fungi is from Maine or California. It's a different species than it is here. Like, do you have any techniques about, like, you've talked about making compost tea from stuff on your farm?
Right. I mean, like Josh said, I think if you follow the soil health principles, it will come on its own without adding it in. If you're starting from a situation where you do feel you need to add something, I mean, like Josh mentioned, I've made some basically fermented herb, preparations that I've added to my soil, and there's definitely some microbial activity going on there. But yeah, I think we'll talk about more specific, examples of things you can do beyond just adding it in with something you've purchased. So
I will mention one of the best things I ever did for my farm was there was a local tree service going by, and I got their wood chips dumped on my farm, and then I made a compost pile with like half wood chips and half animal manure, like from my cows, and I let that stuff cook together for a while, and when I spread that on, like I could just see I could scoop into it with my loader, and I could see the mycorrhizae. It was like a white haze inside that compost pile. So I just felt like, and that mostly came from the wood chips, I think. Remember, if you're farming anywhere in eastern Minnesota or Wisconsin, your soil was built by trees. All right, and that's what fungus grows on, is trees, like in the soil too. But like tree roots, decaying trees. I can't stress enough the importance of making sure you have a good fungus population in your soil.
all right, so we talked a little bit about some soil disturbances. So basically we're trying to reduce these soil disturbances to improve the health of our soil. The most obvious one that I think most people think of is physical, which involves tillage of your soil. So one analogy to think about is if a tornado comes through your community and destroys your home or your town, if it comes through once a year, you can probably rebuild that, your home and everything. But if it's coming through twice or 3 times a year, every single year, it's going to be really difficult to rebuild your home and community. So it's kind of the same with tillage. Every time you go through with the tiller, you're really mixing up that soil and kind of destroying the habitat of all of those beneficial organisms. And if you do it once a year, you might be okay, but if you're doing it 3 times a year, it's just going to be really difficult for them to rebuild every time. So if you're doing it, 2 or 3 times, is there a way maybe you can just do it once? So it's not about making drastic changes, it's about kind of cutting back and doing kind of what you can to start going in the right direction. And as we mentioned before, tillage is going to result in compaction and kind of what we saw with that second example over there. So then going from that, there's also kind of biological and chemical disruptions. Biological, for example, if you're overgrazing and not giving the plants a chance to grow back, they're going to have kind of limited root functioning and they won't be feeding the microbes in the soil. And then the chemical disruption, just if you're adding chemicals, you're going to be throwing the balance off of the life forms that are living within your soil. So I don't know if you have anything to add on the soil disturbances, but.
Yeah, it kind of speaks for itself. I would just say from my own experience, I kind of told my story of my first few farming years were like definitely over-tilling things. And, if you must use an implement, I own a field cultivator, a plow, I have all that stuff on hand. It's a tool for the right circumstance. It's not a default practice. And when you're cultivating or preparing beds, that's, I can use my walk behind tiller, but just the top inch. There's not all that much there anyway, but to kill those weeds at white thread stage when you really want to get in there, or with a hoe, a wire weeder, whatever, just really try to stay shallow during your cultivation. Yeah.
Okay, so we did some introductions, but we're going to get more into some of the examples that are from our farms of just kind of some practices we've tried to help improve soil health. So just briefly about kind of the background of the soil on my farm, I guess. So I rent from a former dairy farm, so I'm really lucky that there's good fertility in the soil. But the problem when I came in was really kind of the practice of tillage for excessive amounts of tillage, at least what I felt was excessive. I'm pretty lucky in a way that I didn't come from a farming family, so I wasn't pigeonholed into certain practices that were like forced upon me. And I was lucky enough to find the SFA early on, so I was kind of introduced to these practices. So as I have been able, I've started to incorporate more of these principles just into what I'm doing at my farm. Little by little, just experimenting, starting small, and kind of going from there by seeing what works and what doesn't work. And like I said, my philosophy is that as long as I have healthy soil, it's going to make everything else a lot easier. So that's kind of, I do a vegetable CSA, and I'm expanding into eggs and culinary and medicinal herbs this year, which obviously incorporating chickens will bring more livestock into the operation. And then by planting more medicinal and culinary herbs, I'll be bringing in a lot of perennials and also increasing the crop diversity at the farm. So.
So my farm is in Henderson, which is about an hour southwest of here on the Minnesota River. And I come at this from a background in ecology, ecosystems. This is what I went to the U here for, was ecology and wildlife management. I grew up on a dairy farm, but my family farm fell victim to the farm crisis in the 80s. So my dad sold the cows, he sold off most of the land, he kept 40 acres in the home site just to live on. And so I left for college never thinking I'd return, but I guess he couldn't take the farmer out of me, couldn't take the country boy out of me. After 2 years in corporate life in downtown Minneapolis, working the cubicles, I moved back home. Yes, I literally did that. I had business casual, short hair, no beard. I did that for a few years. Anyway, so and my wife Sally, she grew up in Minneapolis, does not have a farming background, but I was fortunate she followed me when I decided to leave the city. And so I don't know how many, 18, 17 years later after that move out of here, we have 3 boys. That's an old picture. My oldest is 13 now, and I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. So our operation is 40 acres of what's left of my family dairy farm. My dad still lives at the home site with the big barn and everything. We built a second house in another part of the property. So we have a 5-acre field that is what I'm currently using for vegetables, where we've been certified organic since 2010. We do a CSA, we're at about 50 members now. We've been as high as 120 members. But that's when I realized I'm stressing my farm too much. I need to scale back. We also do wholesale. We supply some of the food co-ops and some restaurants. And we have a relationship with Minneapolis Public Schools to supply them with Brussels sprouts. So we also, I'm too diverse. I also do carpentry and I play music, and I never set out to just be a vegetable farmer. So my struggle has been how to be effective in my diversity, because diversity is resilience. That's a principle of nature. That is how we need to operate our lives and our farming operations. I want to have a self-contained system where I'm not buying in compost, I'm not buying in manure, I'm not doing that, I'm producing it on my farm. The more I can produce my own fertility on the farm, the less my expenses will be. So we have beef, we have chickens. I mean, just 2 or 3 beef cattle a year, nothing huge, but they're on pasture. We usually do between 5 and 10 pigs a year on pasture, and that's a great system because we can take our produce, trimmings, leaves, whatever, feed it to the pigs, and they give us manure to feed back. I also have 10 acres of hay that I bale hay and do some small grains for the cattle. And same there. So I can, just from right across the county road, I rent 10 acres of my dad's former farm from what is now my neighbor, grow hay, feed to my cattle in the winter. They make a huge mountain of manure and bedding. I compost it and put it on my vegetable fields in the fall. So yeah, that's kind of what we do. And what's not listed on there is my maple syrup operation. We have 300 trees that we tap. I'll be tapping this weekend. So that's our farm. I come at it, I've come to understand the soil principles a little bit more recently, but I come at it from an ecosystem, a holistic system. You know, really the following the principles of nature, I think, is really the simplest way to do it. I wanted to offer, if people need to take a short break, a few minutes, or if you have questions at this point, we could just stretch a little bit. How are you feeling? All right. So maybe take 5, and we'll see you back in a few minutes.
Take a picture of this to show my neighbors.
Can I read those pictures?
Oh, sure. There you go.
I've gotten into a routine of plowing every other year. I don't do it as a default practice every year. Some of my fields that are really good condition on stuff. No, I mean, if I'm growing carrots, yeah, I'm going to need to take, I have a BCS tractor, I'm going to need to just fluff out the top couple inches of soil to get good seeds. So some of it is necessary. That's why it's we're not saying don't ever do anything to your soil. It's but be specific. Yeah. Unless you okay. An example of where I would go deep plowing or deep tilling would be if I'm trying to fill alfalfa. If I've been growing alfalfa for 3 years, the roots are this deep. The only way to fill that is plow. And then I have to just get killed so it's all dead, and then I can start so just it's a tool for the right circumstance, and oftentimes you're only going to know that right circumstance. But it's okay. That's how we learn. Right? There's so many darn mistakes in life. I've never farmed. Yeah, great. So I don't know how soil is something we're going to the healthiest soil is so if you have, if it's just been left a while, when it starts to degrade, yeah. Agriculture is destructive. Demand is so high. The demand for all of our so that's our local food. That's our core.
Right. And I think people are becoming more aware of this. It's becoming something like people are becoming aware of otherwise we'll kill them pretty fast. Exactly right.
Notice, pay attention, that's the
those are some things that I questions in the text.
Get into the books. Like, there's as many opinions about that as there are books. My personal rule of thumb is I group things into plant families: cabbage, a broccoli, and a mustard green. They're the same. They have similar requirements. Contrast to that, tomatoes, peppers, so I'm not like, oh my god, carrots, tomatoes, and peppers. I try to do I'm often planting the same family in the same soil year after year. I try not to. I would say ideally if you get 4 or 5 years at one location. No, 4 or 5 years between if I plant a family, location, I don't want to see another for 4 or 5 years. That's an idea. So if you have one garden and one row, over 5 years should see like 5 different types. Some people say 6 years, some people say 7, some people say 8. I think everybody's back. We're gonna we'll try to move fairly quickly. We only have maybe 10 or 12 slides left, but we wanted to build in plenty of time for questions at the end too. So.
Okay, so the first soil health principle is keeping the soil covered. So one of the main things we can do there is cover cropping. And this is an example from my place. So on the left there is, in the early spring, you want to, cover crops are good for those open windows where your soil is just bare. So for example, here this field was going to be tomatoes, peppers, and basil, but you can't plant those as early, so you're gonna have either weeds growing or, or whatever's growing. So I basically broadcasted some oats and then just pretty much some leftover winter wheat and rye seeds that just never got planted before. And I was like, why not just throw those out there? I mean, I have them. Just hand broadcasted them. I raked them in a little bit, keeping kind of the beds with the walkways as I raked in the seeds. And then I let that grow for as long as possible until I was gonna mow it down. And then I used this scythe that I ordered from a company in Wisconsin called One Scythe Revolution, and he provides really great knowledge and equipment. But a scythe is it's inexpensive compared to like a lawnmower. You're walking in your fields versus driving in your fields. They're quiet, so you don't have to listen to like a loud motor running, which is a plus for me. And they're versatile. It's not that hard to do, honestly. It's pretty easy to do. So anyway, when I was maybe like a couple weeks out from when I wanted to plant my tomatoes and peppers, I mowed down that cover crop and let it kind of die back, or wilt back a little bit, and that helps smother out some of the weeds and add some biomass. And then I just lightly tilled that in, again, just the first couple inches if you can. And since I'm planting transplants in there versus direct seeding, it doesn't need to be worked in like to a super fine tilth or anything like that. So that's kind of just one example of something that you can do, and this was a fairly small scale. Somebody mentioned or asked about the movable hoop houses, and you can see the two hoop houses. The one in the foreground is actually a movable hoop house that I built with a friend of mine with some like scraps laying around the farm. I used like an old cattle door and like cut that in half and made that into the skids that we actually pull that along to move it. And then I just use earth anchors and some ropes to secure that into the ground, and because of my location, that was enough to prevent it from blowing away. And the rotations that I've used it for, last spring I started my spinach in there super early in the spring. I moved it off of the spinach and then started some like small baby carrots, and then I don't think this ever happened, but in theory the next phase was to move it off of those carrots after germination and then plant the tomatoes in there. So that gives you 3 positions in that early season. I think this year I'm gonna plant basil in it. It's really small. It's only like 18 by 18 feet, which is a really weird size for a hoop house, but the disadvantage of that small size is you get more temperature extremes. So it gets colder and then it heats up more. But all in all, it's been a fairly successful experiment, so definitely something worth working with if you're kind of looking for a season extension. But that's kind of just an aside since somebody had asked about that. So, so this is just another example of what I'm doing at my farm. The picture on the left, you can see I've got shallots planted right next to carrots. And I have a lot of purslane and lamb's quarters growing at the farm. So basically in those garden beds, I've kind of tried to eliminate all of the weeds except for those weeds, and I've allowed the purslane to thrive. And that purslane helps keep the soil covered. And then I harvest it and put it in the CSA boxes because it's actually like high in omega-3 fatty acids. It would be a great like chicken feed if you don't have a market for it, but you have livestock. It's going to give you like high omega-3 fatty acid eggs, for example. So that's just kind of an example of both keeping the soil covered and also keeping a diversity of roots in the soil at the same time.
I love eating purslane. I mean, I'm out there.
It's good.
I'm out there and I'm just like
kids love it too.
Working in the garden.
It's tangy.
Yeah.
I don't know. Has anybody tried it or like just? Yeah, it's pretty tasty. So. Okay, I'll have to try that.
Trying to get my CSA customers to like.
I had some people that got the lamb's quarters and they were like, oh, I wish I would have got the purslane instead of the lamb's quarters in the CSA box. And I was like, okay, next week I'll throw some in for you. Yeah.
Cool. A couple pictures from my farm that are illustrating the soil principle of keeping your soil covered. So the one on the left, this is hairy vetch, which you saw in baby stage out of the high tunnel. And that was a fall planted. I planted in the fall, I planted hairy vetch and oats together. So the oats winter killed, and in the spring the vetch came up. And that's, my dog was sitting out in the field. I'd say the vetch at highest was about this tall. It's just this thick, viney, massive stuff. And I think when it just starts to blossom, which is what you see here, it has fixed up to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is all you need for any vegetable crop. So it was at this stage in June, and I disked it in, I mowed it, and then I disked it in for a few weeks, and I transplanted winter squash, and then we got a huge rainfall that killed it all. And so on July 4th, after this, July 4th, which is like super late, I direct seeded winter squash. And it was the best squash crop I've ever had. And so I attribute it somewhat to the fact that I had this amazing cover crop on the soil prior to that. So I incorporated organic matter and nitrogen, and I had really nice squash. On the right, this is a system I've started doing some of my fields. These are Brussels sprouts. So basically I've tilled in strips in a permanent grassy cover. So this is a permanent lane grass, this, and this. And so I've alternated, here's a cash crop, and then here's a cover crop. Here's a cash crop, here's a cover crop. So I've alternated, and so this was last year, some of those Brussels sprouts from Minneapolis schools. And so this year, this was hairy vetch and a few other species. I'm going to plant my Brussels sprouts here, and I'm going to plant cover crops here. So if you have the land space to do it, it's worth it. That's where soil health is actually more profitable in the end, because you will get higher yields in a smaller amount of space. So just some examples of keep your soil covered as much as possible. Yeah?
Can you explain what disked in?
It's an implement. I'm at the scale where I can have a tractor and a pull behind it. It's called an offset disc. You might know,
What does it do?
It just basically stirs the top 2 or 3 inches of soil.
So you mow that first?
Yep, mow it to kill it, and then after a few days, let it wilt, and I start to stir it in. In this case, I actually would use a shallow rototiller to do that, because my disc is 12 foot wide. Like that's for a whole field scale. Like on one bed scale, I would just use the rototiller to stir it into the top. Oh, you had a question?
Yeah, since you mentioned that you had 2 cows or something.
Yep.
Can you use those as what do you call what animals eat? Pasture. Yeah.
Yep. That's a great question.
Can you use that as pasture? Can you distribute it, or?
So what you're going to run into with incorporating animals directly into your growing operation is food safety. So we don't want animals to be manuring near our vegetables.
Yeah, I kind of thought this is what the dog's standing right now.
Right.
Is it too far from that? Or
So I should also mention I'm certified organic, and I can't have raw manure hit my field for 120 days before harvest. So where I can do it is in the fall, once my vegetable farm is done, yet I still have green cover crops out in the field, and I do have a fence around my field. Then I can bring my cows in to graze the cover crops, and they will add manure right to the field. But only in the fall, because if I'm trying to do that in the spring, I'm running into food safety regulations. That's a great question.
Just as a follow-up, if on your farm, you're farming 2.5 acres, if you have 2.5 acres set aside,
Yep.
here you can pasture that.
That's up to the inspector who comes out to my farm. And that has to do with slope. You know, if my cover crops are uphill from my vegetable fields, no way. If it's the other way around, they might allow it. But as long as I'm going to have a buffer strip in between where they're not allowed. So yeah. Thanks for asking that. Another way to keep your soil covered is mulching. I had some old hay, and I know parts of my soil needed organic matter, and like I said, my farm used to be a forest, so it was used to a couple of inches of leaf litter and stuff every single year. I need to keep that up, so I will often go out in a place where I haven't, I'm not going to plant vegetables for a month or two, and just throw hay out there and throw straw out there and just get and let it break down and incorporate it in. Like I've noticed on my farm, the more organic matter, the more carbon I can put into my soil, the better it will be. But that does do that in an area where I'm not going to put that mulch down and then plant vegetables in it a week later, because the process of mulch or carbon breaking down into your soil can actually tie up your nutrients for a while. So that's something to be aware of. Yeah, question.
Bueno, en este caso nosotros vamos a sembrar en camas. El mulch podemos utilizarlo como cobertura para la cama para que no crezcan las hierbas.
We'll be using beds to farm, and can we use the mulch like this to just keep the weeds away?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
En la cuestión de certificación orgánica, ¿qué pide el inspector? ¿Que la paja o el mulch sea de natural o
And for organic certification, does the straw have to, or the mulch have to meet certain requirements? Does it have to be organic in a way, or what?
Yes. All inputs need to be. I don't worry about it because my hay and my grain fields that the straw comes from are also certified organic. So that's another advantage to sourcing things from your own farm, is you know and trust the inputs. So you brought up a good point there. I use this as a soil amendment, but you can also use hay and straw as a mulch to after you've planted to just keep weeds down. So there's different uses for hay and straw.
I think here we just wanted to point out that you can, on the left there, they're using just grass clippings for mulch, so those work great as a mulch. Kind of just use whatever you have on hand. I've used leaf mulch for garlic mulching, or for other mulching, and that works good as long as
I have too, leaves on garlic, that's great.
Yeah, as long as you chop it up real good. So oops.
Oh, and here's some people do potatoes with straw mulch. So these are potato plants, and instead of hoeing and cultivating your potatoes, some people do like a deep straw mulch in their potatoes, and the potatoes will actually develop in the straw mulch. So that's something to experiment with. Try grow potatoes in bare soil, and then try grow potatoes with the heavy straw mulch. I've heard that if you mulch your potatoes with straw, not only does it provide all of the benefits of keeping your soil covered and moisture and all that, you don't have potato bugs with straw mulch.
So basically, instead of hilling your potatoes, you're kind of adding more straw as the plants grow. One thing a few farmers pointed out with this method is that some people did have problems with potato blight spots on their potatoes, and that might depend on your soil or the amount of moisture, I would imagine. But just something to keep in mind if you try this method.
Always experiment though. That's farming. It's just if you get settled into something, it can be problematic. Yeah.
So I'll pass this around real quick. This is just something I've been doing the last couple of years. Basically, I go through all my old garden seeds, and I've got all the seed packets and then the seed mixture right in here for you to take a gander. But I look for basically my seeds that I'm not going to plant this year, and I just mix them all together and use that as a homemade free cover crop. One thing to keep in mind is if there's plants that you have disease problems with, or plants that are prone to disease, I wouldn't put them in this mixture, so I don't use nightshades, cucurbits, or beets and things like that. So it's more lettuces, brassicas, mustard greens, some chicories. And there's different ways you can manage this. Obviously, it can be a placeholder, just like a cover crop, like I mentioned before your tomatoes or after. You can let it grow up and actually harvest the greens that are growing from that. If you allow them to grow in flower, that's going to attract some pollinators. what I did was just broadcast them where I was going to grow my summer squash as kind of a placeholder. And then I lightly tilled that in to get some biomass before I was going to plant. But what I found was that a lot of the seeds that didn't germinate the first time around germinated then. So I kind of had this like living mulch of like basil and lettuce and stuff around my cucurbits. And the one disadvantage was that I couldn't go in and cultivate with a hoe without, you know, cultivating up these herbs and vegetables that I had planted. So something I'm kind of going to try again and fine tune and just experiment with a little bit more with that technique. So another technique I like to use at my farm, especially since I have a smaller space, is interplanting. So on the right you can see with like my brassicas, I'll plant a row of radishes and some, I think those are chicories, or you could do lettuces work good for that. And then it's keeping the soil covered, it's shading out some of your weeds, it's increasing the crop diversity. A similar type of thing with the cucurbits, so I had some pest pressure with that, so I was really worried about that the next season. So when I transplanted my cucumbers, I direct seeded a circle of radishes around them. So obviously this is a little labor intensive if you're having quite a few, but you're putting a little work up front to get some of the benefits. So basically the radishes were like a first line of defense against any bugs that were gonna try and attack those cucumber plants. I also did a circle of diatomaceous earth as like a second line of defense because I was like super paranoid. But then the radishes, as they grow, they're gonna help keep the moisture in for the cucumbers and shade out the weeds. And then as you harvest them, it will give the cucumber space to grow. And you can leave a few behind to flower and attract pollinators as well. So
it looks so beautiful too.
Thanks.
Are those bush cucumbers or are those vining?
They are vining cucumbers, so I did put trellises in like after I did all this, which I wouldn't suggest. It just kind of, that's how it worked out. It'd be a lot easier to do it beforehand if you can.
Bueno, otra de las cosas que no sé si se tiene que tomar en cuenta, el pepino, el tipo de raíz que tiene el pepino.
I don't know if another thing that needs to be considered is the type of root that the cucumber has.
Y el tipo de raíz que tiene el rábano
And the type of root of the
para
radish.
formar una estructura del suelo.
To be able to have a structure in the soil.
Yeah, that's something I think about with companion planting is what level of the soil is that plant going to be taking up. So for example, with cucumbers, they have a fairly shallow root system. You don't want the radishes to be too close because they can be sensitive to disruption. But, you know, for example, intercropping a crop where you're going to have the root crop next to maybe something where you're getting a fruiting crop later on. But you're also kind of, one thing that I've really had to experiment with is the timing of the planting, and I think that's almost more important than the root interaction. You kind of want to make sure that you're going to be getting that companion crop out and harvested before the next crop is really going to start filling in. So it kind of spreads out your harvest, and basically instead of weeding the weeds, I'm pulling out the radishes at that point. I mean, you're going to have weeds too, but less of them hopefully.
Might as well pull a cash crop out.
Exactly. So that's kind of one thing, you know, that has been working out for me pretty good. So I think it's worth the extra labor up front, but you just kind of have to bite the bullet and do it.
Could you interplant mushrooms for cash crop as well as to promote the mycorrhizal?
Yeah, I know there's certain varieties, like I've wanted to experiment with this more too, like growing wine cap mushrooms in your hoop house with tomato plants. And I've never done that. I'm going to try it this year in the hoop house. I don't know if you've had experience.
I have just grown mushrooms on logs, but I would think if you, the types of mushrooms that you inoculate like a bed of wood chips, you know, and then plant around that, why not? Yeah.
I think wine caps have a really short lifespan, but they're well suited to that purpose. So I don't know how well they work as a cash crop. I kind of wanted to do it for the soil health benefits and then like personal mushrooms, basically.
And then after a few years, if your wood chips have broken down, you can, that's just
right
adding good stuff right into the soil.
So, and those from Field and Forest has those in Wisconsin if you're interested in the wine cap spores. So this is just another example of some companion planting, onions with lettuce. Obviously onions don't compete with weeds, so that's a good, lettuce is something you can companion plant with almost anything.
And onions take so long to grow, and your lettuce will be harvested long before the onions are ready.
So those direct seeded, or you don't transplant those?
These ones were not from our farm, but I believe
These are transplanted.
I believe they're transplanted. I transplant even scallions.
Oh, no, the lettuce.
Yeah. I'm guessing
looks
based on the perfection of the spacing that they must be.
Yeah, it looks like transplanted.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try
Generally-
this in my high tunnel this year.
Yeah.
This very same thing.
Generally, transplanting as much as you possibly can is going to be, for a small scale vegetable grower, will be your best bet.
I agree.
And then a little bit more on interplanting. So the Three Sisters garden, I know we've both tried at our farms, and that's kind of has cultural significance if you find that interesting, but it has some pros and cons for actual production.
I would try it out. I mean,
yeah, it was worthwhile, I would say.
Ahorita que estamos en esto de cultivos intercalados, asociaciones de cultivos, en hortalizas, ¿qué método o qué técnica es la que mejor puede dar resultados? ¿Intercalados, en franjas, mixtos?
Interplanting and lay rows mixed together.
En su experiencia, ¿cuál es la que nos puede servir más? Primeramente para la salud del suelo y posterior para tener una productividad.
In your experience, what helps more as far as the health of the soil and also for the productivity?
For is interplanting compared to something else, or?
Interplanting con qué?
O sea, ¿en qué sistema de plantación? Por ejemplo, si son en franjas, si son intercalados, si son
What's best? Like have strips or one row of each, or groups?
it depends on your scale.
Depende de la escala en la cual está trabajando.
So I can illustrate an example of this. On the right, this is my farm, and so I had always known that the indigenous peoples of this land, Ojibwe, Dakota, and the people of the Dakotas, they did what we call the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. I took a trip last year to Oaxaca, Mexico, and looked at and learned all about la milpa. La milpa. Yeah. I've been there. It's amazing. But so we saw this in action, and that's the origin. The indigenous peoples who were doing that up here, that technique and those crops were developed in Mesoamerica. So I came home all inspired from my trip, and I wanted to try a milpa plot on my farm. So I selected varieties that were, heirloom varieties of the indigenous peoples around here. And so if you don't know, the corn grows tall. The pole beans use the corn as a trellis. And then the squash vines out and shades the weeds, and it's an incredible system. My first year doing it, I had okay luck with it. I had a good crop of corn. I had a good crop of dry beans. The squash weren't so big. But I did get 3 crops out of the same, so it increased biodiversity, benefited my soil health. And I did it in rows because I have a tractor, and I cultivated with a tractor. So
all those in one row?
Yep. So a hill, like a hill, and then 3 or 4 feet down the row was another hill. Some people do this system where it's 1 row of corn, 1 row of squash, 1 row of corn. I'm going to experiment. I'm going to keep trying it and seeing what works on my farm.
You remember how much space between each classes in that row?
Usually a 3 foot by 3 foot is what I tried, but I think it was a little close.
The corn, the bean, and the squash, were they all like in one
The way it was described to me in Mexico is they just took a handful of seeds and plopped it in, and that's what I tried.
I did the Three Sisters garden, I did it a little differently. So I used a mound system based on more of a grid, and I did a 4-foot spacing between the center of each mound, and I planted the corn seed first, and once the corn seed emerged and the seedlings were about this tall, I planted the beans, and once the beans emerged, I planted the squash. And it worked out great for me. The only problem I had was my first round of squash didn't germinate, so the second round was a little bit too late. But I think if it wasn't for that, I would have had 3 solid crops of them. So.
In your row crop, do you have a planter that you planted your corn and beans?
I have 3 boys. So I took a dibble stick and I have a 3-foot pace. I would step and poke a thing, and each boy, one boy had corn seeds, one boy had bean seeds, one boy had squash seeds, and they walked behind me and planted. So we planted it all by hand. Cool. I know it looks straight, but I'm also a carpenter, so I know how to make straight lines. So, are we still in the first soil health principle? There's like 5, but...
We're on 1926, so...
Cool. Anyway, so we've kind of been talking about, I just want to remind you of the soil health principles, 5 of them. Keep the soil covered is 1. Minimize soil disturbance. Increase crop diversity. Keep a living root in the soil, like all year round. There's living roots in the soil in those high tunnels. And then integrate livestock. Just wanted to briefly describe this. These are tomatoes on my farm. And this is what you would call weeds. I got a heavy rainfall, like 5 inches, and then a few days later another 5 inches. And the soil didn't dry out for like 2 to 3 weeks. And by that time, the weeds and grasses were established. I just decided to leave them. Rather than get all stressed out about weeds, I'm going to use them as a living mulch. So I just went in there and I kept mowing them. And I didn't let them go to seed. Like, you can keep your weeds around. Weeds are nature's soil builders, right? Annual weeds. So it's okay to do that. It worked great for me. And I finally did go in and mow them and till them in before they produce seed. We've kind of talked about this stuff. This is a very common thing in Minnesota, is after your summer plants are done, let's say your tomatoes are done, plant a combination of winter rye and hairy vetch in the fall. And it will overwinter, grow up in the spring, and then you incorporate that into your soil in the spring. The rye is good for killing weeds and suppressing weeds, and the vetch is good for nitrogen fixing. Just wanted to point that out.
One thing to keep in mind with cover crops too is think about what kind of equipment you have and if you're going to be able to terminate the weeds in the spring. So for example, I don't have a lot of heavy equipment, so I tend to plant cover crops that will winter kill, like oats or something like that, because then in the spring I'm not going to have a nightmare of not being able to get rid of these like cover crops that I planted.
And that, it's like you got to find out what works for your farm. I do have heavy equipment. That's just a passion of mine, is old rusty stuff that I fix up. So like, I can go in and disc down a couple of acres of stuff. Works for me. So
we wanted to touch briefly on incorporating livestock. So obviously there's a lot of ways to do this with grazing cattle or chicken tractors, hogs. So the advantage of chicken tractors is, especially with food safety, you're going to be able to control a little bit more where the chickens are going. But yeah, it's kind of a fun, interesting method to try out with livestock to get started. So.
And incorporating livestock can also mean, like, what I've described in my farm is I'm kind of paranoid about my organic certification and the raw manure rule. So I have my vegetables here and I have my livestock here. They're separate, but I incorporate my livestock by using their composted manure on my vegetable fields. So
Or again, like you mentioned, having them come in and clean up your fields in the fall when you're not going to be harvesting stuff all winter. So
remember, our soils were built with grazers. Like there were bison and elk around in this upper Midwest, and they were a part of the ecosystem here. So yeah, again, the equipment depends on scale. You know, there's walk behind tractors, there's manure spreaders you can pull behind an ATV. That's my grain drill. It's 80 years old and it works just as good as a new one. I fixed it up. And this is how I plant my cover crops on larger scales, is with the old grain drill.
I have a little bit smaller scale, so you saw the scythe earlier in the presentation that I've used for mowing cover crops. I found like a broadcaster at the thrift store for like a few bucks, but I actually just prefer like tossing it out and raking it into using the.
I'm curious, how do you plant cover crops?
I've used an earthway seeder. Do you guys know about like an earthway? So I use an earthway to plant like my beans and beets and some of my other crops. It's just like if you look it up, it's a really simple like direct seeder that you can use to direct seed your vegetables. But I've used that to plant cover crops. It plants one row at a time, so you got to go back and forth like a bunch of times. But yeah, I mean, just hand broadcasting and raking in. Like I said, when I do rake in, I try to stay in. You know, I walk down my walkways and I rake the bed so that I'm not trampling the seeds, and I try to time it out before we're going to get a rain event so that they'll get good seed to soil contact. But yeah, I have like a walk behind tiller. I have access to a tractor tiller, but I use pretty basic equipment, and I've still been able to incorporate cover crops without super fancy like mechanical stuff, because I'm the opposite of him, where the mechanical stuff is not my thing. So I'm like, give me like a hand tool any day over like a tractor, to be honest.
I've started out with heavy equipment, and I'm now like trying to just do mostly by hand. So
yeah,
the benefits of small scale by hand are there for sure.
I'm just wondering what scale your operation is like. How much do you find is manageable with those methods?
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit less than an acre, and I could probably go up to about an acre. And talking to some of my vegetable grower friends, even that have tractors, they kind of say 1 acre per person is really like probably a reasonable amount. So I don't know if that's how you feel, but
I would agree.
Yeah,
I have 3 acres, but it's my whole family helps, and then we also hire a couple part-time people.
Yeah,
sometimes it's barely manageable.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on my own, with the exception of like one very part-time employee. But I mean, I think it's about getting your systems down. You know, it's really doable once you get your systems down. So.
Una pregunta un poco. Yo creo que dentro del ecosistema también influye mucho la familia. Usted tiene 3 hijos, puede implementar también una familia para trabajar.
Part of the ecosystem includes family. I mean, you've got 3 sons. I mean, yeah, it's part of your ecosystem. So to read that.
Yeah, I think that a farm is definitely. I've heard a definition of a farm is the people, the buildings, and the land is a farm. So take that for what you will, I guess.
We just have a couple more slides here, and they're like, one of our soil health principles is incorporate livestock. Like if you can get some livestock manure on your farm, even if you don't have livestock, try, because these soils were built and require some sort of animal manure. So do you have a local dairy farm? Do you have a source of composted poultry manure or dairy manure? Seek those people out. I have an organic dairy down the road that he often just says, well, come and take all you want. So I rent a dump trailer and bring my Bobcat over, and I just fill it up and bring it to my farm. Because it's a problem for him, and it's something I need, and it's local, so it's ecosystem Correct.
Another thing to keep in mind is that from a food safety standpoint, if you can get composted manure, that's going to be a lot lower risk amendment to add versus like a raw manure. So there's sources like there's a company in Wisconsin called Cowsmo that's a dairy, and they compost it. So I get composted manure from them, and I know that it's not just a raw manure, and they use that process that is the correct process. So
I use them for my potting mix.
yeah,
too.
I've gotten potting mix from them as well too. So.
Bueno, cuando mete usted el estiércol, ¿usted lo compostea o como dice ella, ya lo compra composteado?
When you get the animal, I can't remember the name in English.
The manure.
The manure. When you get the manure, do you compost it, or what do you do with it?
On my farm, I do the composting myself. I have a bobcat. So I can turn a big pile, make a heap. So that's where the equipment helps me. I'm not making compost to organic standards. It's considered, if you're familiar with organic rules at all, I have to consider it aged manure, and I have to spread it in the fall. Because if you're going the organic route, compost to an organic certifier means something that's been turned, tested, heated to a very specific process. I don't do that. So
yeah, I decided just to not do that because it's really difficult to actually make real compost. So it's something I've decided to outsource until.
So we do both. I also, another thing, there's plenty of suppliers for poultry crumbles. I use that stuff. That's like the only fertilizer that I get in that I spread. It's composted poultry manure. There's a few different manufacturers around here. Sustain is one, and Cashton Farm Supply makes another one. So that's a fertilizer. I can put in a fertilizer unit on my tractor and go fertilize crops with it. But that's poultry manure. That's a way to incorporate animals onto your farm. There's fish fertilizer. I use that in my greenhouse. Some other, like I mentioned, wood chips, wood ash as a compost amendment, compost tea. Your farm made, what do you call it? Do you have a name for it?
Yeah, I don't have a name. I mean, I foraged for like some nettle and some yarrow that were at my farm, and I just basically put it in a 5-gallon bucket, filled that with water, stirred it like 50 times in one direction, 50 times in another direction to aerate it. And then I do that every day and let that ferment until it will be obvious when it's ready. And then I strain that through some mesh or whatever, and then add that water to dilute that down. And there are herbs that are used in like biodynamic farming, which I'm not like knowledgeable in that, but they're herbs that just have these minerals and vitamins. It's like adding a multivitamin to your garden, basically. So it's like something like, obviously, if you have access to those weeds, you can just make fertilizer for free, and it makes a great foliar spray. So something that's worked pretty well for me the last couple of years. So I'm gonna keep doing that. So
that's super inspiring.
Yeah, it's cool. It works good.
I was just going to ask, foliar spray is something that goes on the leaves?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and you can water it in at the ground level or foliar spray, like your different, like even fish emulsion, fish manure. Or fish manure. Is that a thing? I don't know, probably.
I think it's just fish slurry.
Yeah. But I would say with the foliar feeding, just make sure you're spraying. I like to do it in the evening so that it's not going to be on the leaf through the heat of the day, and then it kind of gets the nighttime. Some people do it in the morning, but I prefer the evening. So. And
fish emulsion fertilizer, you can put that into your drip irrigation lines, inject it in, and just. So I think we're just about out of time, and we just wanted to say soil health is human health, is true wealth. And there's a lot of us in the sustainable organic farming community that really truly believe that the only sustainable future for humanity on this planet is soil health. We have to go to that. We cannot do destructive farming practices. It's not sustainable in any way.
So we have this handout for you guys to bring home,
Yep.
and it's got a lot of like great information that we talked about today. I'd also like encourage you to get involved with the SFA, just like a personal like plug that it's been like a really nice networking to get to know other farmers, and there's regional chapters and lots of events and stuff they do too. So yeah, that information is all, there's a lot of great resources and stuff on here, so make sure to take one of those.
And if, please take that and just network with other farmers. You're already doing it, with MFA and like Sustainable Farming Association. I also am networked with Land Stewardship Project a lot. They're a great organization. So there are plenty of people out there to help. And
I don't think we have much time for questions, but I can stick around a little bit afterwards if anybody has any specific questions.
yeah, I'll be here too. I'll stick around.
So yeah.
I can't see too much success with this. Maybe I didn't shake it up. Well, no, I do see a few layers. So if we turn the lights on, maybe it'll be a little bit better. Come up and take a look at how it's separating. Sometimes it takes like overnight, So yeah.
Well, thanks for listening. And
so pass these around.
And then we also have, if you would like to, if you feel so inclined, feel free to leave your contact information if you'd like to get information about like soil SFA events and stuff coming up. We'd be happy to take that information and keep you in the loop on what we're up to. So here, do we have a pen? Yeah, we can pass that around too. Sure.
And so I'm trying to picture my field.
Okay.
What's it?
I've got half an acre.
Okay.
Josh.
So,
Yeah.
would we not be able to do like cover crop early this spring?
So when I do like the early spring cover crops, so basically, say you till your whole field at one time, and you're gonna plant like.
Yeah, I think it's just one. I'll let you fill it out and then I'll fill it out.
So I think about like which vegetables are going to be. I can't plant out until.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. So I take that time frame.